Hello, Cynthia. So excited to have you here. It is definitely an honor to be talking with you and be able to pick your brain on the Fast to Heal Stories podcast. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I've been looking forward to connecting with you.
Thanks. Yeah, I have to tell you, I've been in the space for about 3 years. I've been intermittent fasting for about 3 years. Before that, I taught the standard stuff that really didn't help my clients a whole lot. But when I was doing a deep dive into intermittent fasting, and the first book I read, like a lot of practitioners, was the Obesity Code. And I just sat with an open jaw, like, no way. I cannot believe I haven't been teaching these methods all along. But I was doing a really deep dive and I was watching some YouTube videos by Jason Fung. And then I stumbled across your TEDx talk. And I sent it out to all my family. It's like you get excited about something, you know that it works, and you start sending it out. And I don't know who actually, which one of them watched it. But I remember telling them, like, if I did a TEDx talk, if I could say exactly what I wanted to say, this would be it. So appreciate that you were one of the first people that I really started following and studying. So glad that your book is out. We're going to pick that apart first. So let's go into that. So Cynthia Thurlow is a nurse practitioner. Tell us a little bit, we're going to pick your book apart first and unpack that, but tell us a little bit about, how you got into this space and why you even wrote your book, which is called Intermittent Fasting Transformation.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I'm so glad to know that the TEDx, my second TEDx talk, really inspired you and inspired, a lot of your work. That's incredibly gratifying to hear. Well, I am a traditionally trained nurse practitioner. I was an ER nurse in inner city Baltimore. I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie. I moved, not surprisingly, into cardiology and worked in cardiology and critical care for 16 years. And when I became a parent, I had my oldest son, who's now almost 17, which is hard to believe, developed terrible eczema. And like the dutiful nurse practitioner, I put steroid cream on it. And, at that time he was only 4 months old. So he was just getting breastfed. And I kept taking the pediatrician and kept saying, is it something that I'm eating? Because I could tell that there had to be some interrelationship because his eczema would wax and wane. Oh no, that's not it at all. And then after, nearly 12 months of watching him itch and be uncomfortable and, doing all the things to try to treat his skin, I finally asked to go to the allergist. And, the concept of taking your 1-year-old to a pediatric allergist is a little bit overwhelming. And I think for those of us that are healthcare providers, we think we know, but I didn't know. And so it turned out my son had life-threatening food allergies to peanuts and tree nuts. And I was instructed with this itty bitty, well, he wasn't so itty bitty, this chunk-a-lunk that I needed to carry an EpiPen and pray. And for any parent that has children with food allergies, that did not sit well with me. I had taken care of many anaphylactic, life-threatening food allergies and situations as an ER nurse, certainly as an NP, and that didn't sit well with me at all. And so I really spent time thoughtfully. I was making all of his food. I was looking at every single food label. I read a book a few years later called The Unhealthy Truth, and that changed everything for me. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Robin O'Brien's work, but every chapter I read made me more angry, recognizing that there's so much profitability in the processed food industry, very little focus on food transparency. And it just made me angry as a clinician that I didn't have the right information, not only for myself with my children. By that point, I had more than one child, but even with my own patients. And that really sent me down a rabbit hole. And I started with, maybe I'm going to do a doctoral program. I took a class and hated it. Then I did a wellness coaching program, and that didn't do it for me either. And then I stumbled upon another book. And this is why I'm such a voracious reader and why I see the value in books and how transformative they can be, called Eat the Yolks. And that book really just lit me up. And I reached out to the author, who graciously responded to my message and said, where did you get your training? And so that then dove me down a rabbit hole of functional training. And that then, shifted my entire focus. And within about a year, I had a side business, and I was still working as an NP. And I woke up one morning and said to my husband, I can't do this. I can't do this anymore. And I'm married to a very fiscally responsible, conservative engineer, finance guy. And he completely lost his mind. I said, I can't write another prescription. I cannot be beholden to a system that is so broken. What I really want to do is be able to make a larger impact. And so I left without a business plan, which I don't recommend, no business plan, out into the entrepreneurial space, and almost instantaneously had a large group of women who wanted to work with me, because many women in middle age feel like their needs are not being met. There's a lot of misinformation. I think that the diet industry has really created a toxic culture for women, and it gets worse as we get older, because what used to work in your 20s and 30s is no longer working. And that got me interested in talking to women about hormones, their hormones, not necessarily bioidentical hormones, but hormonal regulation in the body, and the influence of nutrition and the influence on lifestyle strategies. And it really got me very excited and very hopeful. Now, the tangential part to this whole conversation is that I'm an introvert, and a lot of people are surprised to know this. And in 2018, I said to my husband, I want to do a TED Talk, because I was so inspired by someone that had done several, because he was going on to build homes for needy children and medical care for needy families in Africa. I saw that and I was like, inspired action. I want to do a TED Talk because I want to be able to be philanthropic. I would really like to be able to do that. And so I was offered my first in December of 2018. At that time, I was offered a second. And for anyone who's listening who doesn't know how the TEDx world works, you can't do a talk about the same thing twice. So my first talk was about perimenopause, super sexy topic. And I looked at my husband when I was offered my second, and I said, what do I know a lot about? And he said, intermittent fasting, because this is something I'd been doing for several years. And so as easy as that was, boom, that was how I made that decision to do the talk. And so obviously the talk went on to impact a lot of lives. And, I'm very happy with my cardiology background, talking about metabolic flexibility, talking about metabolic health, talking about things in a way that I didn't before as a clinician. And obviously now I like the concept of sustainable lifelong strategies for men and for women, although I've really fallen into the women bucket. And so what brought me to the book was that obviously that talk in 2019 went viral. And then all of a sudden I was in a position where I was like, wow, I really can make a big impact. And was delighted and excited when my book went to a bidding war and an auction. And then ultimately I signed with Penguin Random House, and, the book came to fruition in the midst of a pandemic and children being at home and schooling at home. I managed to write a book and move a couple times, but I really feel that this is my life's work, other than being mom to my children and a wife to my husband of 19 years. I was really meant to write this book. And I think women largely have not been well represented in research. And we've been led to believe that our menstrual cycle is an inconvenience to researchers. And so I think that I'm standing on a platform with a lot of other women at this life stage saying future generations are going to know more and be able to anticipate more than we did. Like, we're not going to allow this culture, this kind of toxic culture, to continue. We really want women to really understand and lean into their physiology, not apologize for it, and certainly be able to navigate perimenopause and menopause and not feel a degree of shame. Unfortunately, that's a whole other tangential conversation, but that's another platform that I feel like I represent women, that, women should not feel like they have to apologize, because things change. I mean, anyone that's listening, irrespective of what life age range you're in, things are going to change at some point, and it is going to throw you for a loop. But I'm here to tell you that fasting is definitely a really great way to, find that balance again, find that equilibrium, feel like you're in control and not out of control, and feel like you're still worthy and valid and, appreciated. Because unlike a lot of other cultures, here in the United States, there isn't always this respect for people that are a little older than us, or necessarily know a little bit more, have a little more life experience. And I think that that's something I also hope to be able to, contribute to in a positive way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. My kids are about the same ages as yours. I have 18, 16, and 13. And I was a dietitian when I got pregnant with our daughter, almost 20 years ago now. And it makes me angry that I didn't know what I know now when I was pregnant, because I was just following the standard guidelines that I was teaching, and I was probably eating better than most. But if I could, like, I would eat completely differently than I did back then. We just didn't have the knowledge. So totally agree with that. And that's basically how I came into the space too. Like, my son got very ill. I started to do some digging. Things weren't making sense. I started to see things that you can't unsee once you see them. And same thing, I said to my husband, same thing. I can't do this. I cannot be in this conventional space teaching these nutrition guidelines that I don't believe in, that are making people more ill. So same thing. I was a little bit later, but about 3 years ago. Well, it's about 5 years ago that I left this space and took a couple of years off. And I didn't think I'd ever go back. I was like, I don't want to be in that system. But like you, it's like, I feel like now we have to educate as many people as we can. So your platform is so wonderful. You're reaching so many people. And now the book is out and it's laid out so nicely and so easy to follow. So let's talk about that a little bit. So intermittent fasting transformation, and the subtitle is the 45-day program for women to lose stubborn weight, improve hormonal health, and slow aging. So why did you pick 45 days, and what's in there that it really is, pertains to women and targets women?
I want to start off by saying I really applaud you for taking that leap. It's so much harder to stay in a broken system than it is to pivot and really go contrary to, what we were trained in. I think there are probably lots of healthcare professionals that are listening to this, and I think that our courage to leave a broken system inspires others to do the same or even change the system. And so I want to make sure that I acknowledge that in you, because I know how valuable that is. Now, when it comes to the book, so you can imagine, so May of 2019, the talk started to go viral, and it completely crushed my business because we had no idea that was going to happen. We were not ready for what happened, and you can't predict it. So let's be clear about that. And so pretty quickly, people were coming to me asking for, how can you teach me how to intermittent fast, both men and women? So initially it was both men and women. And my team and I created content, or I created content that my team kind of got organized. And, we started off with 60 days, then we tried 30 days, then we tried, and 45 days was the sweet spot, really like a 6-week period of time. And so it really was that granular that I felt like 60 days was too long, 30 days was too short, 45 was perfect. And then really fine tuning content. Like each time I taught it, it was fine tuning what we were doing over and over and over again. And so by the time I got the opportunity to write the book, I was like, oh, I've got this whole program because I do this every, 3 or 4 months. And so that's really what came out of it, was finding a sustainable time frame in which people could learn the basics, feel confident, start seeing some results. And let's be clear, a lot of people come to intermittent fasting to change body composition and lose weight, but it's all the other things, kind of quote unquote, behind the hood or underneath the hood, that people are like, oh my gosh, I feel so much better. Like, I want to continue doing this, even though it's, initially it can be challenging because we're conditioned to believe that we get up and we eat breakfast, and most breakfast, as you and I know, is really dessert disguised as breakfast. So there's a lot of unpacking and changing, and people really struggle. Some people really struggle at the beginning because they've been eating, as an example, too many of the wrong types of carbohydrates, too much of the wrong types of fats, and too little protein. So they're never satiated. They are always hungry. They're miserable, and so they're in a broken system, not understanding why they have to continuously, every time they go to their healthcare professional, they get put on more medication. Your blood pressure is still not good. Your diabetes is out of control. You're gaining weight. And I remind people that broken system, in many ways, what we have been teaching our patients for a long, long time, is just inaccurate. And I feel has really contributed to the rise in metabolic health disorders. And there's lots of research to support this, and you and I both know this, but I think when we say to people, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I had an Italian mother, and my Italian mother, there were a lot of rules in our house, but one of them was you eat a meal and you go outside. But I wasn't in school. And so there was no snacking in my house. And my mother made almost everything from scratch, which is a true blessing. We didn't have a lot of money growing up, but my mom was very focused on food quality and there was no snacking. And so the whole concept of the snacking culture is making us fat and diseased and sick. And so fasting as one strategy is a way to fine tune your body back into better equilibrium and better balance in the way that we are designed to thrive and not just kind of survive whatever life stage we're in.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I would love for you to go, but we've talked about this on the podcast before a little bit with having to vary your fasting depending on what life stage that you're in. So if you could touch on the differences with how women should fast, and it's like men have a little bit easier time because they don't have the hormonal fluctuations that women do. But can you touch on the differences between like the menstruating women, the perimenopausal women, and the postmenopausal women, and how, you really need to vary your fasting depending on which life stage that you're in?
And I think this is a really important discussion because there weren't very many people talking about this. There are a couple, obviously, that are, but most people were putting men and women in the same bucket, and women were wondering why in the world things were not working. Like, I have a very fit, athletic husband who effortlessly fasts all the time. So let me just be clear: menopausal women, so women that have gone more than 12 months without a menstrual cycle, and men are aligned in the respect that they get away with a whole lot more because they don't have the hormonal flux day to day, week to week, month to month. So let's put them in one little bucket. Now, cycling women at peak fertile years, 35 and under, I am very protective of each woman, whether they are choosing to procreate at that point in their lives or not. I'm very, very protective of this unique group. Now, we know that 88.2% of Americans, based on a 2018 study, and I'm sure it's probably closer to 90 given the past 2 years, but when we look at that data, most, if not all women, even in their peak fertile years, could benefit from 12 hours of digestive rest. And really, that's what all of us should be doing. We eat too often, too frequently, wrong types of food. So women that are at those peak fertile years really have to lean into, you don't fast the week before your menstrual cycle, as an example. And if you're a lean woman, again, peak fertile years, you need to be not fasting all the time. You don't need to. There's not a great benefit from doing really long, crazy long fasts. Now, if you have PCOS, you are insulin resistant, you're leptin resistant, you are hormonally dysregulated, you can benefit leaning into your fasting, your menstrual cycle. There are specific times, and I talk about this in detail in the book, Intermittent Fasting Transformation. I identify how to fast and when to fast. And then perimenopause is its own special, unique time. And for anyone that's maybe not familiar with that term, it means the 5 to 10 year period before you stop menstruating altogether. And for many women, that starts in your late 30s. Many of us, myself included, I had kids in my 30s. I assumed I was exhausted because I had a demanding job. Even though I worked part-time, I had 2 young kids. My husband was traveling a lot. I exercised. I did all the things. And it was probably very likely this slow reduction in progesterone secreted by the ovaries. Our ovaries, ladies, are as old as we are. It's unlike sperm that gets replenished, I believe, every 72 hours, if memory serves me correctly. And so by the time you're 38, 39, 40, your eggs are old. And that this is a biologic fact. It's not a judgment. It's a biologic fact. And so as your ovaries are producing less progesterone, you may start having trouble sleeping. You may be more anxious and depressed. Your cycles may get very heavy because you have this relative ratio of more circulating estrogen to progesterone. You add in our modern day lifestyles where we're exposed to estrogen mimicking chemicals in the environment, personal care products and food, amongst, just tainted water and all these other things that we get impacted by. And this is when your periods might start getting very heavy. I used to affectionately refer to these as the crime scene period. And this might be the time that you go to your GYN and they offer you the following: synthetic hormones, an IUD, an ablation, or when all else fails, they'll offer you a hysterectomy to control your symptoms. And I say this with love and reverence because I am friends with many GYNs and nurse midwives and NPs that offer well women care. However, understanding that your body in perimenopause and in menopause is much more sensitive to sleep quality, stress management, anti-inflammatory nutrition. Gone are the days that you can get by eating Domino's pizza at 2 o'clock in the morning. I mean, those days are gone. Alcohol, sugar, I mean, all can be of issue. And then also this chronic cardio mindset where people think I need to be on the treadmill to offset this cheeseburger I ate. And so again, I go back to this toxic dieting culture that is really embedded, especially here in the United States, really embedded into our culture. And these are the conversations that we're having. So perimenopause is a unique time. You have to eat differently, sleep differently, manage your stress, work out differently. And that continues into menopause because of a lot of physiologic changes that are going on in the body. And the easiest way to think about perimenopause is it's reverse puberty. So I have teenagers and their hormones are ramping up and mine are ramping down. And this is a normal function of the aging process. However, it doesn't have to be your destiny. I went to my 30th high school reunion and I was shocked. I would say most of the guys looked pretty good. And there were definitely women who looked great as well. But then there were some people who just looked incredibly inflamed. They were clearly insulin resistant. They were riding the struggle bus big time. And so I think that we need to embed this information into the discussions that we're having with patients and into our culture at a much earlier stage. So if a woman who's 25 knows, and I know at 25, I was probably arrogant and didn't even have to think I could eat whatever I wanted and, probably didn't exercise and just work my nursing job. But if we knew what was coming, we could anticipate some of that. So when I talk about fasting, it is very different for each one of those stages. Cycling women, peak fertility, perimenopause, and menopause. And then also, I think the other thing that is important is to talk about women that are pregnant or breastfeeding and why I fervently believe this is not a good strategy, nor is it a healthy strategy when you're growing a human or feeding a human to eat less food when your body physiologically needs more to be able to produce a healthy human and to make high quality breast milk.
Yeah, totally agree. And there's always, people are always asking like, who shouldn't intermittent fast? That's the first thing I say, like if you're pregnant or breastfeeding, no, like your hormones are wonky, you're growing a human, or afterward, like I remember I breastfed all my kids for a year and the amount of food that I ate was unbelievable. I would say it's at least double what it is now, and the amount of water. I mean, it was
Absolutely.
crazy. And I loved it. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can eat so much. But yeah. And I didn't know about intermittent fasting then, but it's interesting how you walked us through the life phases for women, because I'm 46. I tell people on the podcast, like whatever my age is, I don't try to hide anything.
Yeah.
But my menstrual cycle, like it's still like 28 days, like every 28 days, 29 days. And I wear an Oura ring so I can, I see the temperature changes and I'm like, yep, here it comes. Like, I don't even need the Oura ring. Like but I don't even really feel it coming anymore like I used to. And I feel like it's like I have to be in perimenopause. I mean, I'm in that age frame, but I don't feel it yet. And I feel like my cycle in my 40s, since I've been intermittent fasting and more metabolically healthy and regulating my carbohydrate intake, is more regulated in my 40s than it was in my 30s and even into my 20s. And in my 20s, I was on birth control for several of those years, which is one question I really wanted to ask you about, because I've heard you talk about this before. And this is a topic we've never talked about on this podcast, is birth control and the pill and how that can mess up your female hormones. And do we need to think about anything differently with intermittent fasting or taking the pill and what that really is doing to you hormonally? We haven't touched on that. So I'd love for you to explain a little bit about that.
Yeah. So for full disclosure, I took oral contraceptives for a long time. And so there's no judgment. People need high quality birth control, and that is one of the options. I think what's not oftentimes discussed is what actually happens when you take synthetic hormones that essentially are knocking out communication between the brain and the ovaries so that it helps. And I'm oversimplifying, but it's an oversimplification of what's going on. Now, when women are on, whether they're using an IUD for hormonal contraception or there's copper and then there's the progestin IUD, or they're using oral contraceptives, obviously you're not having a real period when you get a period. It's just a breakthrough time frame. I find a lot of women have worse PMS when they're taking the oral contraceptives. And so they know when it's coming. And so it's the same kind of methodology that I'll say to them, okay, we want to kind of back off on fasting heading into when you're going to have your bleed week, which is not really a bleed, it's just a breakthrough. I sit on two sides. One, as a woman, understanding why it's important to have high quality birth control. I sit on another fence saying, I think if most women understood and were fully that if they really understood what happens, because there are a lot of women that have this post-birth control syndrome where there's so much miscommunication between, or not, there's a lack thereof of communication between their hypothalamus pituitary axis and their ovaries, that it takes a long time for their body to kind of get realigned again. And so I always sit on this with this, again, the two sides. Like, I want women to have access to birth control because that's critically important. Number two is having full disclosure about what actually happens when we take it. And the fact that we know, like, as one example, when you take oral contraceptives, it is impacting pheromone regulation. And so you may not pick the same partner that you would pick if you weren't on oral contraceptives. I mean, this is really interesting research that it can impact the type of partner you select. And so I think that from that perspective, if women fully understood, if they really, really understood, they might think, okay, well, maybe I need another type of birth control. And actually, I'm getting ready to interview a GYN specifically on this topic, because it's a source of frustration for so many of us that we really look at the research. Like, if you change your pheromones or the type of person you're attracted to, could you end up with not the partner you're intended to have children with or be married to, et cetera. Thankfully, I chose well. I'm sure you chose well as well. But I just think about this artificial dysregulation between the brain, the ovaries, making choices about partners, who we're choosing to be intimate with. I mean, this is a lot to kind of unpack. And the more I understand, the more I kind of go, I don't want to say that all hormonal contraception is a bad idea, because I think women like spontaneity when they're with a partner. They don't want to have to think about using, a diaphragm. I mean, that's something that's obviously, it doesn't require hormones, but it requires, you have to stop what you're doing to go take care of this, or, using condoms, which a lot of people don't like. I know we're getting very tangential, but what I would say is, if you're taking oral contraceptives and you're having your bleed week, you need to treat it as such. And I find most women, their PMS is so bad on the pill. Like, I didn't realize that I actually didn't have bad PMS till I came off the pill. I was like, I had no idea. And it was because I was more concerned about not getting pregnant before I got married and to my husband than I was about the net impact on what happens to the gut microbiome and pheromone production and partner selection. And just the fact that it took my body a while when I went off oral contraceptives to start getting a menstrual cycle again. And so I think that it really begs to a bigger discussion of, what is the net impact? And was I really given the full ramifications of what this synthetic hormone was going to do to my body? And I just think a lot of women are solely concerned about contraception because, you're 20, 25 years old. I totally get it. But we don't realize what net impact that has on us later on in terms of fertility and, like I mentioned, the gut microbiome and partner selection and pheromones and all these other variables that we probably aren't thinking about at that point.
Right. And I know I was never told about any of that. And I started taking oral contraceptives in my late teens into my 20s up until I had children. And the pheromone thing I had never heard ever until I heard you talk about that on a different podcast. I was like, that is so interesting. And I never in my wildest dreams would have put those two things together. But it took until it was literally like probably in the last 5 years that I really thought about how I conceived our children. So my daughter, who we had first, we have a daughter and 2 sons. It took me about 8 to 9 months to conceive her. And I was getting frustrated. Like, there must be something wrong. Like we were thinking, oh, we're coming up on a year. And then all of a sudden I got pregnant with her. And then when we were ready to start thinking about having our second child, I thought, well, it'll probably take me another 8 to 9 months to get pregnant. And it was like, boom, it was with the second month. And then our third, our third son, our third child, who was our youngest son, we weren't even sure that we were going to have a third. So it just happened. So it took me forever to think, well, duh, I was coming off the pill. Like my hormones needed to regulate, but it never dawned on me at that time that that was probably, I can't say with 100% certainty, but that was probably the issue. And people just don't realize that you're really turning off a lot of the natural hormones. So I was so excited when my husband agreed to a vasectomy after our third child. So I just didn't have to think about it. So thank you for that explanation. And really, again, just getting education out there. And I know when my daughter was 14, we went to her well child visit and she had not started menstruating yet. And her pediatrician was like thrown back, like, really? Because most girls get their periods so much earlier. And here she was 14. She's like, you know what? If she doesn't get it in like the next year, maybe we should think about putting her on the pill. And I was like, no, like, no way. I didn't say that to her, but I thought this is crazy. And then she did get it. She was almost 15 when she got her first menstrual period, which hopefully none of her friends or whatever listening to this podcast, but she's now 18 and things are very regular. But I think back, if I would have listened to that and, bought into that and not known any better, I think a lot of people or a lot of girls are just kind of thrown on the pill, or they have acne, or they have other hormonal issues at the base root cause. So I appreciate you going into that. But let's talk about, you list several myths in the book, and I just want to touch on one because it's really annoying to me. And this is probably the one under all the myths that you list that really just gets me every time somebody says it or it comes up in conversation. And that is the myth that women can't fast. So let's debunk that and talk about that a little bit, because obviously if it were true, we would have died out as a species.
Well, and that's
couldn't go long periods of time without eating.
Yeah, no, I mean, food scarcity is a real thing. And so before the processed food industry, before refrigeration, before pasteurization, food scarcity was a genuine concern for people. And if women were not able to weather food scarcity, I agree, we would not be here as a species. That's actually my standard kind of refrain. I think that this fear-mongering culture is a source of endless frustration. And I talk to other physicians and researchers about this all the time. It just makes me wonder, when people come out against fasting for women, it's probably because they have an agenda. And if we look at the research, if we look at trends, if we follow the kind of what the last 50, 60 years have looked like, it is so aligned with the fact that we thrive when we eat less frequently. Now, it's not to suggest there might be people listening that they don't do well with fasting, and I can respect that. However, I think everyone should be doing 12 hours without eating. Every single person listening. I think that irrespective of gender and irrespective of life stage, as you kind of alluded to, there's definitely people that should not fast. But when someone suggests that it's harmful or dangerous or some type of ridiculosity, which I know is a made up word, but it's just sometimes I lose the ability to articulate how frustrating it is. To me, it limits women's ability to have access to good information. And that, quite frankly, the older I get, the more frustrated I become when women that need good information don't have access to it and are afraid to make choices and changes out of the overconsumption of, or I should say proliferation of, I want to believe people are well-intended, but whether or not you are a fit pro or a nutritionist or a licensed healthcare provider, or heck, you just have a platform in which you like to discuss your personal ramblings about different topics. There's a lot of information out there, and it can be very challenging for women to get good information, consistent information, and not being an echo chamber. Because remember, I've alluded to this toxic diet culture, and I'm in the midst of writing a talk that I'm giving next month. And this is one of the things I'm talking about, because it's messed up our thinking. You know, we're focused on the wrong things. We're not focused on nutrient density. We're not focused on the right types of macros. We're not focused on where we are in our menstrual cycle. And we're sure as heck not focused on the fact that there is so much arbitrary processed carbohydrate crap in our diets and exposure to sugar, and which is, we're just feeding the sugar beast within us. That is the one thing that I can tell you about this book, is women saying, I have been a sugar addict my entire life. And why have you been a sugar addict? Almost always is a direct reflection on the fact that we've been given, whether it's My Plate or the USDA food guide pyramid, or convincing us to eat breakfast that is more like a dessert tray. We have really been setting ourselves up to fail. And so I think as we're talking about changing the narrative, as we're talking about the fear mongering piece, I think it's important for more and more licensed healthcare professionals to get out there and just say, you know what, I've got a lot of training behind me. I always say, once you know, you can't unknow. Right. And so I think it's almost more important, more courageous for those of us like you and I, and so many others in this space, to be speaking out and saying, I used to teach my patients this, but now I know better. Because people can respect that. You can change your mind. You can say to someone, this is what I used to tell my patients to use, canola spread as opposed to butter, which personally, it's like, it just pains me. Seed oils in and of themselves pain me enormously. But I think, going back to your original question, women can fast safely. They have to be methodical. They have to lean into their bodies. A lot of women are so disconnected from their bodies for a variety of reasons. If we listen to the cues of our bodies and we listen to what our body is trying to teach us, and this is not woo-woo, this is being in touch with your bodies, lady, we all need to be there, is a departure from the narrative that we have told patients for years, where we come in with a symptom, we get a pill. We have a problem, there's a powder, a potion, a pill that's going to fix it. I'm here to tell you, the work is hard, and you have to just do it. And I can teach you all the tips and tricks I've learned to make things easier, but fasting is absolutely a strategy most, if not all, women can utilize. They just have to learn how to do it, what I consider to be the safest way, without a lot of, how should I say this? Without a lot of smoke and mirrors, because there are people out there. I mean, there was a company that approached me that made me laugh. They wanted to be a podcast sponsor, and it was a fasting bar. And so I said, explain to me how marketing a product to eat while fasted is somehow not breaking your fast.
Right.
And so it was a unique, like, it was out of question. I just said, no, this is not aligned with my methodologies and my mindset. And I said, but how many other people out there that want something healthy to eat on the go are going to buy that bar and think they're not breaking their fast? So it's those kinds of things that, really dispelling and looking at research and, using something as a best practice, and then being open and saying the N of one is very powerful. So each one of us might need to fast a little differently, and that is okay. And that is such a departure from how I used to practice as an NP, where it was like, okay, someone comes in with high blood pressure. Yes, I have 100 options, but these are the ones I like. And I'm going to give you this drug because I know I'm going to get this result generally, with the lowest amount of side effects. And so it's that same kind of looking at each individual as their own bioindividuality really rules. And so I think that's important for women to understand. That's BS that you can't fast. You do have to take other things into account. It's not as easy as it is for menopausal women and men. However, that doesn't mean that you can't do it. And so I hope that explanation at least provides women with the understanding that the N of one is powerful, bioindividuality rules, and with very few exceptions, most of you can try fasting, even if it's just 12 hours of digestive rest.
Right. If you want to consider 12 hours fast, right?
Well, I sometimes I have to say 12 hours of digestive rest so that people understand, like, there's a starting point. Yes. And for a lot of people, they eat from the moment they get up until the moment they go to bed. And so that's terrifying. Like, you'll be sleeping 8 hours. But I don't know what to do after dinner. I'm used to snacking, and then I eat as soon as I get up. And it's really reframing our relationship with food and our hunger cues and really kind of leaning into that. So 12 hours might not be terrifying for some, it is for most. But that's a good starting point. Like meeting people where they are is also important.
Right. I totally agree with you there. But I was one of those people. I was an early morning runner and I would eat like a string cheese and a banana at 5 o'clock in the morning before I went for my run, because I had it in my head that I needed to have some carbohydrates. That's, not only was I in the dietetics field where that's the mantra, but in the running world too. So it took me a long time, like even to go to 9 o'clock was a big challenge for me when I started out. And now it's like I done day long, couple days, 3-day fast, and know that my body is equipped to do so. But yes, I couldn't agree more. I feel like we should just really be focusing, instead of saying, women can't fast, let's educate them how to fast properly for where they are in their lifespan and change the narrative that way. But yeah, it's like people are just getting kind of used to the timed eating, and the intermittent fasting is becoming somewhat mainstream, or at least they've thought about it, but now we're like throwing that in there. So yeah, baby steps, but at least we know how to educate people.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing the other thing I think that's really interesting that I see quite a bit in the Fit Pro community is, does it fit if it fits your macros? So when we talk about macros as protein, fat, and carbohydrates, which I know your listeners are super savvy about already. I always say, like, no, that's not how it works. Your body, if you eat 5 donuts, is going to respond differently than if you choose to eat a piece of fruit, maybe like a lower glycemic berry. It's going to respond very differently. And, the fiber in the fruit is going to slow down the absorption. And I mean, I always tell people, like, maybe at 20, you can do that. Like, I have teenage boys who are athletes. My oldest is like 6 feet tall and still growing. His appetite is insane. There's first lunch and second lunch. There's first dinner and second dinner. And he's super hungry, like almost all the time, even though I just cannot seem to get enough food into him. And I just remind people, I'm like, it's definitely one of those things that adults, so I talk about grown ass adults should not be snacking, and grown ass adults do not need to have 2 lunches and 2 dinners. This kid's still growing, but right. It's, really changing the narrative and saying, like, what you can eat at 20 is not what you can eat at 50. I mean, I used to have that conversation with my cardiology patients, and it was usually middle-aged men that struggled with this the most. Women kind of were getting it, like I'm not as hungry. Intrinsically, I'm not as hungry. Men that want to eat like they did as an 18-year-old at 50, and they're wondering why they're like, have a lot of adiposity, they're insulin resistant. I'm like, dude, you cannot eat like you're 18 years old. I know that was fun. Those times are behind us. And I really want you to eat less food, not because I don't want you to be nourished. It's because you're eating too much darn food, and you're eating like pizza and soda. And I mean, again, we could have a whole separate conversation on that, but like getting real with ourselves that if it fits our macros, mindset is damaging on a lot of levels.
Yeah. And our middle child is almost 17. And I remember that whole spurt, like 14, 15, 16, he grew like 8 inches. He's 6 feet as well, and still filling out and maturing, but it's amazing. It's almost like they feel bad asking for more food. It's like, no, you need that food. You're literally like growing overnight. In your sleep. So yeah, we still have another one who is about to hit that time period as well. But yeah, so that kind of wraps up what I wanted to ask you about the book. I do want to let people know that it's laid out in really nice phases too, with the 45 days. And I really love that. But yeah, so easy to follow for women, debunking the myths, working around the hormones. There's also meal plans in there. So a really great book. But I'd love to ask you just a few more questions, and then we'll wrap up, because I want to pick your brain about just a few things that I know I get just so many questions about. And especially on social, it's just it's almost like daily. The first one being, can I follow your plan? Or what do you think about, and this might hit a hot spot for many people, but what do you think? Can I do your plan, or whatever you're teaching, if I'm vegetarian or vegan? And I'm always like, I see that come up and I'm like, oh, I try not to pull away from it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. And it's funny. I think, so here are my thoughts. a lot of people that are vegan or vegetarian, they do it for religious or moral reasons. So I always say I respect that. What I struggle with, and this is just me personally, is yes, you can fast, but a lot of, especially vegans, maybe less so vegetarians, because a lot of vegetarians will still eat eggs. They might do fish occasionally. I almost beg people, please eat some eggs. If you're going to focus on protein density, most vegetarians and vegans lean into soy products, which I'm not a huge fan of. I'm wildly, absurdly anti-soy for a variety of reasons. It's genetically modified. It's highly processed. I'm not even a fan of like miso and tempeh, but if you choose to eat soy, you definitely want a fermented variation. A lot of vegans and vegetarians don't get enough protein in. And if they do, they're eating a lot of carbs. And so ladies, if you're insulin resistant and you're vegetarian or vegan, it is going to be very challenging. You have to be very diligent because lentils and beans, yes, although they are whole food sourced products, or quinoa, that's another one that people say, oh, I eat quinoa. Well, that's great. But 6 cups of quinoa to get the same amount of protein you get in a steak is challenging. And it's a blood sugar disaster. I mean, 6 cups of quinoa, no one should ever eat that much, not even my teenagers.
Right.
With that being said, I definitely have had people reach out very thoughtfully and respectfully. And, you know, my menu planning, there's always swap outs for proteins. It is very hard if you have weight to lose and you need to restrict your carbohydrate intake to get enough protein in. Protein is the most satiating macronutrient, and this is a challenge. I don't have the best response. I do and have brought into my IF45 group, which I teach usually every 3 months. I always bring in experts. Like I have a colleague who's a keto plant-based expert, and I brought her in to do teaching with them. And I just think you're going to struggle getting enough protein and keeping lower carb. It is a struggle. So when I brought her on board as an example, we really talked about blood sugar stabilization and why vegetarians, if they're doing it the right way, they can get more protein in, but they're going to have to be really deliberate about their sourcing. Same thing with vegans. This is when I say, please eat some eggs. Maybe consider if you're going to have, if you tolerate dairy, maybe have a little bit of dairy. It is challenging. It is not to suggest it is impossible, but it is going to be someone who's very methodical, very conscientious. And if you are insulin resistant or diabetic, very challenging. What has happened for many of my clients is they've gone on to eat like lighter proteins, like they've done eggs, they've done some fish, maybe occasionally they do some chicken. You know, it's very challenging. Although I am sensitive to this, I just think women need more protein, especially for all the reasons of what changes that happen in our bodies. North of 40, we're losing muscle mass, and muscle is the organ of longevity, helps with insulin sensitivity. And so beans and legumes and quinoa are not going to get you there the same way having some animal-based protein. And that's kind of where I have to agree to disagree with you know, some peers that think you can hit your protein macros. It'll be very hard, very, very hard.
No, I appreciate your honesty. And that's basically the same response I give people when they ask me. It's like, it's going to be really hard. Like I'm teaching 100 grams of protein around there. You know, there's nuances for that, but for the most part for women. And yeah, like quinoa, you know, like we can't get enough, and it's not the same type of protein. It's not absorbed and utilized and processed the same way. So I'm not anti-plant at all. It's just what I teach is therapeutic carb restriction and focusing on protein first, and then the fat kind of moderates itself. But if we can't hit those goals, you're going to have a really challenging time. So that's exactly how I educate people. It's like, you can do the timed eating part of it, but one, you're going to have trouble fasting because you're not going to be satiated. And two, we're going to have trouble with accomplishing your goals overall, because what I teach is protein first. That's the structure. That's the basis of the human body. We need the fatty acids there to build hormones and neurotransmitters. So yeah, it is challenging. So it is hard because and the first thing I always ask them, well, can you give me the reasons why? Like, is it just something you were brought up with, or is it more than that? And to be respectful of whatever reason that they're following that. So I appreciate your honesty and your answer with that. So I have to tell you, your podcast is one of my favorites because we're in the same lifetime. You know, we have teenagers, and I share a little bit on my podcast about my kids, and but my two sons, especially, like my daughter's old enough where she gets it, like she's off at college, and I feel like I did it. Like she's eating whole food, she's eating real stuff. Like she's feeling like she knows that if I eat A, I'm going to feel like B. Like that's happened with her, but I feel like my boys just aren't there. And I don't know if it's like they're teenage boys, and I don't want to give the perception they don't eat well, because they do, because we eat well at home. But it's been more than once I've gone out to my son's car and he's got junk in the back seat. I'm like, where did you get that? I would never buy that. And he just kind of stammers along. And I feel like there's just more of a kickback with boys. And I know you have all boys. But I feel like my daughter just got it a lot better than they do. They're the ones who are going to go to a sleepover and binge on whatever is at that home. And maybe they just don't feel it yet. But you have 3 teenage boys. Like, do you have tips on for families and this, and then we'll wrap it up after this, but just, with kids, because I'm sure there's a lot of parents who go through my programs. They're like, well, my kids are not going to eat this. And like, how do you do it at your house? Like, how do you ease them in? How do you get them to buy in, and maybe they haven't totally, and you still have some years left with them. But I always feel like one of my goals as a mom is just nutritionally, when they leave this house, not that they have to eat exactly how they did when they lived with me and when I was preparing their food, but at least know what the different foods do once they ingest them.
Well, this is such a timely discussion because, for full disclosure, I walked downstairs this morning and my 16-year-old was eating an apple, complaining that, he didn't want to make his oatmeal, because he does eat oatmeal in the morning. And because he's like super lean and 6 feet tall and very physically active, I don't have an issue with that. And he had his hand in a bag of Siete chips. That's what he was eating for breakfast. So as my kids get older, like my oldest is also my child that has life-threatening food allergies. He is incredibly conscientious about how he eats. However, I've noticed over the last year that, it's become a joke. Like, how much can we get away with when mom isn't watching? Like, for years and years and years, they were 100% on board with everything. And we have cleaner variations of some junk in our house because I have teenagers, and it's like there would be like mass pandemonium if I didn't have some, like a cleaner chip like Siete, or like nicer quality chocolate. But I'm starting to notice a shift, and as they are becoming more independent, and I have to constantly say to them, like, you're eventually going to go off to college and you're going to have unfettered access to anything. And so I firmly believe and agree with you that we lay the foundation. I don't know if it's gender related, because I have all the same gender. I have all boys, but I do see they respect me and they respect my wishes. And we tend to be a very protein centric family. We spend a ton of money on high quality protein. My kids eat a whole lot more rice and carbohydrate than I do. I tend to be lower carb. But it's always a dance of finding, where can I get nutrient dense foods into them, and then allow them to have some fun foods. Because, like, for full disclosure, I'm dairy free, but we buy organic ice cream, and I don't buy it every week. I might buy it twice a month. It doesn't last. Like, a half a gallon or 2 half gallons will be gone in 24 to 48 hours between my husband and the boys. And so I think each one of us have to kind of decide what makes the most sense for our budget, for our sanity. I don't want my kids to go off to college and never have had, oh God help me, had some junkified foods, because then they will binge. I mean, there's no question. And I'm sure when my son starts driving, it'll be the same situation. He probably will have some crappy foods in his car and it'll make me cringe. Having said that, my oldest plays football. And so, because football, like most towns, it tends to be the biggest sport. The school actually, they get donations from local restaurants, and they feed the football team before their games. And so one time it was Chick-fil-A, and my son, of course, gorged himself because he doesn't eat Chick-fil-A for a variety of reasons. And so he came to me later and was like, Mom, I had diarrhea for like a whole day after eating Chick-fil-A. I was like, I'm sorry to hear that. And in my head, I was like, that's fantastic. Because now
Yes,
you're going to make that
yes.
association and you're not going to want to eat it again, or you're going to eat less of it when you're exposed to it. So I think it has to be based on like your sanity. For us, it's all like my kids eat a vegetable with their dinner. I mean, they eat salad. We don't have a lot of dairy in our house because I find that it tends to aggravate my older son's skin issues, which generally, depending on how much dairy he's had, is generally on the lower end. But I think each one of us have to decide. Like, I don't want to fight about everything. I pick my battles, and we just want to make sure that we're providing a firm foundation. What I think is really sad is when a woman, as an example, and this happens to me too, women that they've got teenagers. Teenage years are not the years your kids are going to agree to toe the party line. Like when they're elementary, middle school age, younger, yes. High school, they become their own individuals and they push back a whole lot more. And that's why I pick my battles. But I always worry about the women who are trying to make better choices for themselves. And then they feel like they have to cook two different meals. And I just tell my kids, I'm like, listen, if this is what you want to eat, we're not making two meals. These are your options tonight. Your next meal is breakfast. And that's kind of how I leave it. I don't make two different meals. There are plenty of times that I don't eat the carbs, like starchy carbs my family's eating, depending on where my carb cycle is. But I think for each one of us, give yourself grace, focus in on what your most important thing is to focus in on, and let the rest go. Because if I spent a lot of time, that's why I told you about my son having his hand in a bag of Siete chips, eating an apple and complaining about his oatmeal. I'm a real life person, and as he gets older, he's going to be my child. He tends to push back a whole lot more. So it gives me an opportunity to kind of say, okay, here's the real world. The real world is, yes, I'm an intermittent fasting expert. Yes, I'm a nutrition expert. And guess what my kid was eating for breakfast?
Right. Yeah. And that's our youngest. Like he will have the bag of chips after school, like the organic corn chips that I eat maybe 10 a month, but I have a bag here just for taco night or whatever. Cause like you said, if you don't have them here, and it's kind of like a bread thing too. Like I haven't eaten bread in years. I'm gluten-free, but my husband thinks we have to have bread all the time.
Yep, that's
So
my
yeah,
husband.
sometimes you just have to let it go.
Yep.
And I go to the grocery store 95% of the time and do 95% of the food prep. So I control what I can here. And then, yeah, you just teach them. And even my older son is starting to get it. He's got one more year here at home, but he was the one, he had ulcerative colitis. And so that's
Oh,
why I'm just
wow.
really protective of his
Sure.
eating habits. And, yeah, but he's doing real well and thriving. But we appreciate you coming on so much. I could sit here, I could interview you for 2 more hours, but we know you have other things on your agenda today. So tell us where we can find you and the book, and anything else you want us to know.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for bringing me on the show and having an opportunity to connect with your listeners. So first and foremost, intermittent fasting transformation is now everywhere. Target, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, or your local bookstore. I am encouraging people to patronize their local bookstore, especially because so many have gone under or really struggled financially the last 2 years. Right now, I know this will drop next week, but right now there's a 21-day challenge that's going on Facebook that is connected to the book. So if you've bought the book, you can participate in that. And there's a pretty amazing goodie bag that is coming. There's going to be one person that wins a lot of really cool stuff from a lot of my very favorite vendors who very generously gave donations to the challenge. I have a podcast called Everyday Wellness. It is probably one of my favorite things to do in my business. I get to interview some of the most amazing individuals in the health and wellness space. I am active on Instagram. I am on Twitter. I'm a little snarky on Twitter, so be forewarned. I have a private free Facebook book group called Intermittent Fasting Transformation that you're welcome to join. And then I teach. I'm no longer taking one-on-one clients. That was a big decision this year. But I do have group programs. I have IF45 that will teach again in May if you're looking for more accountability. And then there's also a program called Holistic Blueprint that is small, and it allows women to do the Dutch test, GI map, and other type of testing. I co-teach that with another advanced practitioner. So lots of ways to connect with me. But thank you. This has been a great conversation.
Yes, lots of different ways. That's exceptional. Get the book for sure. The podcast is amazing. It's always, I have it in my library, queued up, comes out on Saturdays. So I like that because a lot of them come out during the week, and then I go and do a longer walk or a little run. I'm like, oh, good. Everyday wellness is out on Saturday. So lots of great information. We so appreciate you and your time and your expertise, and you're changing the lives of so many people. And so honored to have you out in the field and in the trenches, and joining us in the podcast. So we'll link all of Cynthia's links, social, how to get the book down in the show notes as well. And we really appreciate you sharing all your knowledge with us today. It's been an honor.
Awesome. Thank you.